So in this second part of my endocrine system videos, we are going to focus really on kind of the rest of the glands that we find in this system. And we'll end by talking about some of the local signaling molecules that also aren't necessarily released by a gland, but can regulate our body's functions similar to a hormone. In this lecture specifically, we're going to focus on the other glands of the system, including the thyroid, the parathyroid, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, the thymus, and the pineal gland. And just like we did for the hypothalamus and the pituitary, we'll talk about the hormones that were released here and their functions. We'll also look at some examples of when these hormones are not being produced in the correct amounts. And we'll finish off by looking at kind of local chemical messengers and how small signaling molecules can also regulate functions of our body. So starting with the thyroid glands, we're kind of starting from the head where we had the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and we're moving down. The thyroid gland sits right on in your throat. When you swallow, you can actually kind of feel you feel like the swallowing motion in your throat, and your thyroid kind of sits right underneath. And this gland releases two iodine containing hormones. Your book kind of goes on to explain what these two hormones are, but they're so similar that they're often just grouped and collectively referred to as thyroid hormone, TH, and then there is also calcitonin. Almost every single cell in our body is a target for thyroid hormone, or TH. TH is responsible for regulating our metabolism and the production of heat. So one of the ways we keep our bodies warm is just by actually releasing heat into the body from metabolic reactions. Thyroid hormone is also responsible for regulating blood pressure and helps with the development of several of our organ systems. And the release of thyroid hormone is actually controlled by the pituitary and the hypothalamus. If you remember, the anterior pituitary specifically releases thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. And so thyroid hormone has to receive a signal from the pituitary, from that TSH, in order to know that it needs to release thyroid hormone. So iodine is actually considered a trace element. We don't need a ton of it in our body, but it is very important, specifically for the production of thyroid hormone. So it is something that we do need to have in our diet. Specifically, when a person's diet is deficient in iodine, this is going to decrease the levels of thyroid hormone that a person has. And some symptoms or some disorders that can arise because of decreased levels of thyroid hormone are goiter or cretinism. So goiter specifically, which is shown in figure A here, basically what happens here is that you have low thyroid hormone, and so the pituitary tries to counteract that. So the pituitary starts increasing the amount of thyroid stimulating hormone that it releases. This then talks to the thyroid gland, and it causes the thyroid gland to become enlarged. So it's like, yeah, I see that you want me to produce this, but I'm just not producing enough. So it grows to try to compensate for that. And so a goiter is actually due to the fact that the thyroid is enlarged, and you can see that enlargement happening through the skin. Goiter in the United States has actually been almost completely eliminated, and that was due to the simple fact that we started adding iodine to our salt in the 1920s. So there were regions of the US where the soil was very iodine deficient, and it was known as the goiter belt because so many people had goiter. But by simply adding iodine, so if you've seen most of your salt is iodized, that helps reduce the effects or get rid of goiter. Cretinism is another example where we have lowered levels of thyroid hormone in the body, but this specifically happens in infants or during fetal development. This can be characterized by dwarfism or delayed mental and sexual development. Cretinism is fairly rare. It occurs in about 1 in 3,000 births. So it's a pretty rare occurrence that an infant is born with cretinism. And if the mother produces normal levels of thyroid hormone, cretinism sometimes isn't identified until after birth because the baby gets enough thyroid hormone from mom, but it's when they have to start kind of producing it on their own that you actually start to see symptoms of cretinism. It can be treated if caught early enough. And then there are also examples where we can have too much thyroid hormone being released into the body. And this is shown by Graves' disease specifically. So Graves' disease is actually an autoimmune disorder. And what happens is that there are antibodies that are produced in our immune system that actually mimic TSH, that thyroid stimulating hormone that's released to the pituitary. This also causes an enlarged thyroid because it's overstimulating our thyroid now, which really increases the amount of thyroid hormone that is released. A symptom of Graves' disease is this symptom called exophthalmos, which is shown in figure C here. Basically what exophthalmos is a kind of bulging of the eye outwards, and it can be kind of one of the early symptoms of Graves' disease. So again, notice that it's really important that we have kind of normal levels of hormones in our body because we can get kind of some drastic effects if they are not being produced in the correct amounts. So thyroid hormone is one of 2 hormones released by the thyroid. The second hormone that is released by this gland is calcitonin. And calcitonin is primarily responsible for regulating calcium levels, specifically in our blood. Calcium as an ion, so calcium ions, they have a Ca2+, they have a charge, and these ions are critical for muscle contractions and for just proper neuron function. And so we need a certain amount of calcium in our blood cells, in our blood, in order to make sure that our muscles and neurons are firing properly. And calcitonin helps regulate that. Calcitonin is released by a particular type of cells within the thyroid gland. They're called the parafollicular cells. And so in this diagram, they're kind of shown as these purple cells here. So those release calcitonin, which can then work in our blood to maintain calcium levels. And we'll look at how calcitonin actually works with another hormone to keep our blood calcium at regular levels. So also associated with the thyroid glands are the parathyroid glands. So the thyroid gland from the front here on the left, we kind of only see the thyroid gland. But if you were to look at from the back view, you would see that there are these glands in green in this diagram that sit on top of the thyroid gland. And those are the parathyroid glands. And they secrete parathyroid hormone, or PTH. This hormone also works with regulating blood calcium levels. So it actually works in what is called an antagonistic relationship with calcitonin. And these 2 hormones work together in a negative feedback loop to regulate our blood calcium levels. And that feedback loop is shown here. So again, this is another example where hormones are helping to regulate homeostasis, where they're working to keep our body at kind of a normal level. And specifically, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin work to maintain our blood calcium. So let's look first at what happens when our blood calcium rises. So when that happens, that's stimulated to secrete calcitonin. So when we have high blood calcium, we have an increased level of calcitonin. The response that happens due to increased calcitonin is calcitonin actually tells our bones to take up calcium. Our bones actually work as kind of calcium storage. We have like basically bone salts. That's what makes our bone really hard. And so what can happen is when we have increased calcitonin, it's basically going to tell our bones, hey, take up more calcium. So effectively, we are removing calcium from the blood, which gets us back to normal. So again, notice this is this is a negative feedback loop because our stimulus, which is saying, hey, we have an increased amount of blood calcium, is opposite from the response, which is to decrease blood calcium. So we're negatively trying to regulate what's happening in the body. But the other, we have too low of blood calcium, and now we need to get our blood calcium back up to normal. In cases where our blood calcium falls below normal, that is when the parathyroid is going to release parathyroid hormone. So if we have increased PTH, that's actually going to talk to a variety of organs. It'll talk to the bones, the kidneys, and and the intestines. The bones specifically are going to release calcium. So they are going to increase calcium in the blood just by simply releasing that. The kidneys and the intestines are going to be told to absorb calcium. When they absorb calcium, that effectively also increases calcium in the blood. Everything that's absorbed goes straight to your blood. So in this case, increased parathyroid hormone is also going to increase calcium levels, which can bring us back to normal. This is also negative feedback. Again, our original stimulus was that we were low. We're going to work in the opposite direction to raise our blood calcium back to normal. But notice that the actions of PTH and calcitonin are opposite of one another, and that's why we call this an antagonistic relationship. When one causes the decrease in calcium, the other causes the increase in calcium. So these work antagonistically or against each other to maintain normal blood. All right, so kind of moving down the body, from the thyroid and the parathyroid glands, we then kind of run into the adrenal glands. And remember from part 1 of this video, those adrenal glands are located on the top of our kidneys, and they have 2 regions. They have an inner and an outer region, and each one performs different endocrine functions. So we'll see that the adrenal cortex releases and regulates different hormones than the medulla. So we're going to look at the adrenal cortex first. So the adrenal cortex releases a variety of hormones, but they are categorized into 3 categories, which are the gonatocorticoids, the mineralocorticoids, and the glucocorticoids. The gonatocorticoids in general regulate or are part of the sex hormones. So things like that regulate kind of secondary sex characteristics and things like that. The mineralocorticoids regulate mineral and water homeostasis, so they help maintain our mineral and water balance. And the glucocorticoids affect our glucose levels. There, again, are lots of different types that are described in more detail in your textbook, but just to kind of keep things a little more simple, I really want you to focus on just knowing that there are 3 categories of hormones that are released by the adrenal cortex. Just to give you an example of how the regulation of these hormones is important. So for example, Addison's disease, which actually JFK had. Addison's disease is marked by a low production of cortisol, which is a type of glucocorticoid. So low cortisol which again is a type of glucocorticoid. And also, Addison's disease is marked by a low production of aldosterone, which aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid. And interestingly, one of the symptoms of Addison's disease is actually kind of the bronzed, like almost fake tan look that JFK had. Another example where instead of decreased levels of a hormone, increased levels can cause an issue is in Cushing's syndrome. So Cushing syndrome is actually caused by too much cortisol, an increase of cortisol, again, a type of glucocorticoid. In Cushing syndrome, when someone has too much cortisol, a lot of their tissues start to retain water, particularly the tissues of the face. And so if you notice on the left, this patient with Cushing syndrome has kind of a rounder face. A lot of that's not actually fat, it's just her tissues being expanded. But after treatment, that same patient can lose that roundness in their face. So this is something that can be treated. But just two examples where too little or too much can be potentially deleterious. I also just wanted to bring up, because as we're kind of looking at syndromes and diseases, you might be wondering, well, what is the difference between a disease versus a syndrome? Typically, a disease usually has a defining cause. Like it can pretty quickly be said, like, hey, you have this thing because of this that's going wrong in your body. Syndromes, on the other hand, are where you have a group of symptoms where the cause might not always be definite. So with Cushing syndrome, maybe you have a lot of these different symptoms, but there could be multiple reasons for why those symptoms exist. So disease, there's usually one specific reason. Syndromes, there might be multiple reasons that cause the symptoms that we see. It's just kind of a anatomy and physiology fun fact. So again, these hormones are produced by the outer segment of the adrenal gland. The adrenal medulla is also responsible for releasing hormones. Specifically, it releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are responsible for regulating our flight or fight response. We'll talk more about this as we get into the nervous system, but this is really, so if you, for instance, when you're scared and you have that kind of like, you get goosebumps and you quickly kind of become way more alert and you are thinking about, well, should I run or should I stay here? That is because your medulla, your adrenal medulla is releasing adrenaline, which is going to cause a variety of kind of reactions in your body. And in general, stress can sometimes be good, but can also be bad. So this figure from your textbook, I think, is really useful for looking at the difference between short-term versus long-term stress. And really, stress can be considered anything that causes our hypothalamus to really talk to the adrenal gland. Typically, in short-term stress, so think, you've just been woken from a deep sleep because you think you heard a noise in your house. In short-term stress, those like quick, oops, I'm scared. In those situations, that's when the hypothalamus is going to talk to the adrenal medulla, and that's when we release those flight or fight hormones. And this is when we experience things like increased heart rate, our breathing rate increases, and our blood glucose actually increases as well, because glucose is going to be used immediately by our muscles to produce ATP so that we can run or fight. Long-term stress, though, does something completely different to our bodies. Long-term stress, so like, say you have a stressful job or you're put under kind of really intense situations for a long-term amount of time. In this situation, the anterior pituitary is going to release those adrenocorticotropic hormones, which then interact with the adrenal cortex. So now we're talking to a different part of the adrenal gland, And that's going to cause the release of different hormones like mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. And the long-term stress response looks very different from the short-term. For instance, our kidneys are going to retain water and sodium, so it's going to kind of mess up our mineral balance, where our blood volume and our blood pressure can increase. We can have our liver synthesizing more glucose, which too much glucose in our blood for a prolonged amount of time can lead to diabetes, which we'll talk about here in a moment. It can also lead to the increased breakdown of protein and fat, which can cause weight loss, but also other issues. And it can also decrease the inflammatory response of our body. So long-term stress can have some really deleterious effects on our body. And actually, interestingly, there have been a lot of studies of just why stress is so bad for us. And this guy, Robert Sapolsky, he is a neuroendocrinologist at Stanford, and he actually does a ton of studies with baboons. He's kind of known as the baboon guy, but he has this really interesting book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And basically, he looks at the fact that humans, as we have evolved, we live in an environment where we don't realize it, but we are constantly experiencing a fight or flight response. And that has led, because we now are experiencing long-term stress, we have a lot of these weird just disorders and symptoms that other animals, like a zebra, doesn't experience. And so he actually often uses baboons as kind of his model to compare humans to. You don't have to be like a science person to read that book. It's a super interesting book. It's written for like the general public, so definitely check that out. I think it really kind of puts into focus why you should really focus on not having, or at least working towards not having, so much stress in your life. All right, so that is the adrenal gland. Let's move on to the pancreas. So the pancreas is actually kind of near our liver. So kind of in the same region where our kidneys are, we also have our liver, and sitting underneath that is our pancreas. And the pancreas actually contains both endocrine and exocrine cells, but we're going to focus on the endocrine portion. So remember, endocrine, this is when you release something like into the blood. Exocrine is when you kind of secrete onto the surface of something. So we're going to focus on the endocrine part because we are in the endocrine system. And specifically inside the pancreas, there are these cells called pancreatic islets. They're also known as the islets of Langerhans. They're named after the scientist who discovered them. But in this figure here on the bottom right, they're stained kind of like a gold brown color. And these pancreatic islets produce 3 different hormones. Those are somatostatin, glucagon, and insulin, which we're going to talk a lot about glucagon and insulin here on the next slide. So somatostatin is known more for how it functions in our GI tract. So our stomach and our intestine can release somatostatin, and when released there, it's been shown to inhibit the secretions of our stomach and our small intestine. It's known that the pancreas also produces this, but its function in the pancreas is not fully known. So that function that I've listed here is really showing you how it works in the GI tract and that gastrointestinal tract. But the 2 big hormones that we know a lot about that do come also from the pancreatic islets are glucagon and insulin. And these show another antagonistic relationship, and they both work together to regulate blood glucose levels. Glucagon specifically increases blood glucose, insulin decreases blood glucose. And both of these hormones work in another negative feedback loop. So this again is another example of a very important negative feedback loop in our body. So let's look for the hormone that we are most familiar with, So insulin specifically is released when we have high blood glucose. So you've just eaten a meal. Most of your food contains sugar. And so after a meal, your body says, whew, I have a lot of glucose in my system. If you have a little kid at home, you've seen how after meals they can just like pop up and they're way more active, right? I feel like that still happens to me. And that's largely due to the fact that they have increased blood sugar and they have kind of more energy to do the things they need to do. When we have high blood glucose, that glucose signals to our pancreas that we need to release insulin. So our signal is increased glucose, that's going to release insulin. Insulin actually talks to the liver, and it tells the liver to stop breaking down glycogen into glucose. Remember, glycogen is the storage form of glucose. So when we need more glucose in our body, we can just break down glycogen and release glucose molecules into our blood. But we're going to tell the liver to stop that process when insulin is present in our bloodstream. Insulin also can talk to our muscle cells, and it can say, hey, you need to take up more glucose. Muscles use a lot of glucose to produce ATP to contract. And insulin can also talk to our adipose tissue, our fat tissue, and say, hey, can you store glucose? Can you make some fat out of that glucose so that we can pull this out of the blood? So eventually what's going to happen because of insulin is we are going to bring our blood glucose back down to normal time to eat. And because of that, now our blood glucose can drop. So we can also have the opposite happening, where between meals, or if your insulin's kind of worked too well, our blood sugar has decreased. Decreased glucose also signals to the pancreas, but instead of releasing insulin, now it's going to release or increase the amount of glucagon in our blood. Glucagon specifically only talks to the liver, and it tells the liver, hey, you know all that storage of sugar you have? Please start breaking it down. So the liver kind of goes into overtime. It takes that glycogen, breaks it down into glucose, and so now we bring our glucose back to normal. So again, insulin and glucagon work antagonistically. They do the opposite. One increases sugar in the blood, the other decreases, but they work together in this big feedback loop to maintain the homeostasis of our blood sugar levels. In terms of disorders of the pancreas, diabetes mellitus is probably the most well known, at least kind of in kind of common areas. So diabetes mellitus, again, not to be confused with diabetes insipidus, is a disease characterized by high levels of glucose in the blood. So this happens when people have increased glucose and the feedback loop that works to decrease that is not working. There are two types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. In type 1 diabetes, this typically is caused by your genetics, and it's first seen in kids, in juveniles. And this type 1 diabetes is typically specifically due to the fact that these people do not produce enough insulin, and so their blood glucose is just always too high. These individuals can receive injections of insulin, and that can help them to regulate their blood glucose better. Chapter 10A in your textbook also it's a whole chapter on diabetes mellitus. You can read more about it if you're interested. Type 2 diabetes, or what is typically called like late onset or adult diabetes, typically occurs in adults. It's thought to occur and be related to a person's diet or activity levels, but it's also not entirely known. It can also be caused by the fact that someone stops producing enough insulin to regulate their blood glucose, but there are other factors as well. It has to do with sometimes their cells don't store glucose properly and things like that. So it's not just related to insulin. There can be other factors that are not functioning correctly in type 2 diabetes. Some symptoms of diabetes are listed here. So notice that blood glucose, having too much glucose in our body, can cause like some really kind of interesting, like a wide variety of symptoms that are listed there. But again, chapter 10a really goes into more detail about that, but just know in general, diabetes mellitus is due to the fact that you have too much glucose in your body, and that's caused by typically not having enough, your insulin not being regulated in the correct levels. So kind of moving back up the body, so we were at the liver, now we're kind of moving back up to the top of the rib cage. This is where we will find the thymus gland. So really, if you everyone kind of has like that little dip at the bottom of your throat, kind of right above where your collarbones are. Your thymus gland sits kind of right in that dip, right above your sternum or your breastbone. And there are two hormones that are released by the thymus gland. That's thymopoietin and thymosin. Both of these work together to promote the maturation of white blood cells, specifically the T cells that we talked about last week in our immune system lectures. Interestingly, the thymus gland is more prominent in children, and it actually decreases in size as we age, just to kind of keep that in mind. But again, it's really, really critical in promoting the maturation of those T cells and our immune response. And then the pineal gland, so our last gland of the endocrine system, is all the way back up in the brain. Again, the hypothalamus is here. It's kind of this region that's colored dark purple. And the pineal gland actually sits kind of right behind that. So the pineal gland is a really small little gland, and it produces melatonin. And melatonin is what's responsible for regulating our sleep-wake cycle. You might have heard of the disorder SAD. It stands for seasonal affective disorder. It happens interestingly most frequently in women, but kind of in the like October to like February months. People kind of have reported that they tend to feel like more gloomy, they're more lethargic, they don't really have any motivation to do anything. I know like both me and my husband always talk about that we have SAD because it's just like, winter sometimes. But it's actually thought that this disorder might be caused by having too much melatonin in the body. So it's just basically your sleep-wake cycle is messed up. You're releasing too much melatonin and you just have no energy because melatonin makes you sleepy. I do want to highlight, and this is kind of a nice segue into the discussion that we're going to be talking about this week, but also just in general about dietary supplements. You can purchase melatonin over the counter at like really any like CVS, Walgreens, Rite Aid. You can also, I think, go to any like a GNC, like a vitamin store, and purchase it. And people sometimes tend to take it if they feel like they aren't sleeping very well. If you take melatonin like 30 minutes before bed, you might notice that you feel a little bit sleepier and it helps you fall to sleep. And some people say it really helps, other people notice no change. I do want to note though, so first off, all dietary supplements are not regulated by the FDA. So the Food and Drug Administration really provides no oversight in dietary supplements, and that includes melatonin. And so it's really important that all dietary supplements, you should do a lot of research, you should talk to your doctor before taking them. But melatonin in general has been shown that if you take melatonin as a supplement, your body, your pineal gland actually stops producing melatonin. So if you go off of melatonin as a supplement, you can actually have a pretty messed up sleep-wake cycle as your pineal gland kind of re-regulates itself. So definitely use it sparingly. It's not to be used like every day. It should be only used when you're like, I really need to get to sleep this one night. So, and that's really all dietary supplements. Really talk to your doctor first, and make sure that you're not just like listening to Joe Schmo online saying like, yeah, take this, it helped me, I've never felt better in my life. So yeah, be wary of that. So finally, to kind of wrap up the endocrine system, so remember from the Crash Course Biology video, we have hormones that are very long acting and they kind of can act throughout the entire body. So they're kind of these long distance signals and they're very long acting. The effects of hormones can last for days or months, or sometimes in some cases even years. There are other chemical messengers that function in the endocrine system that are, rather than having a long distance signal, are more localized, and these are referred to as local signaling molecules. These can be released by many of the cells in our body, but when they are released, they only act on adjacent target cells. So, for instance, say we have one cell here that releases some type of chemical signal, it's only the cells that are right next to it that can react to that signal. So this is a very localized thing. What's nice about that is this is a very fast response. Remember, sometimes hormonal responses can be slow. Some examples of local chemical messengers are prostaglandins, growth factors, and nitric oxide. Prostaglandins are released actually by most of our cells. Your book describes there as being like 16 different prostaglandins. So they have a variety of functions. They can do everything from influence your blood clotting, they can regulate your body temperature, they can help in your inflammatory response, they can even aid in your reproductive system. Your book, Ladies, goes on to explain that some prostaglandins are actually what causes cramping during your menstrual cycle. And it's been shown that a lot of these things, prostaglandins, can be regulated by like anti-inflammatory drugs, like things like ibuprofen. Growth factors, these are different from growth hormones. Growth factors are, so they don't go over long distances and they're not long lasting. Instead, they get a localized fast stimulation of cells to grow, to develop, or to multiply. So rather than affecting your entire body, these growth factors are only going to talk to cells that are directly next to it. And then interestingly, nitric oxide, which is a gas, that should say gas, not glass. This is a gas that actually functions in the dilation of blood vessels. So it actually opens up your blood vessels. It's been shown to help also stimulate and relax smooth muscle contractions in the body as well. But it's kind of weird to think that a gas can act as a chemical messenger. So just some examples where we can have these, besides these long distance, long acting signals that are hormones, we can also have these local chemical messengers that can produce localized fast responses. And so just to wrap up our talk of the endocrine system, I just wanted to remind you here that we do have a discussion. And this week's discussion on D2L is all about whether or not hormone therapy is safe. And so we're presented a lot, especially lately, with advertisements for hormone therapy. And what I've done is I've given you guys some advertisements for hormone therapy clinics. And using what you now know from your Crash Course Biology and these 2 recorded lectures, I want you to do some research and look at these ads and discuss the claims that are made by these clinics. Are they valid? Is hormone therapy a good idea, or is it something we should maybe stay away from? So I posted more detailed instructions on D2L that you can follow, but to kind of keep in mind what we're learning about here, you can bring that into your discussion this week.